You know that person who survived every economic crash of the last 40 years, raised themselves as a child, kept the lights on for their kids and their aging parents at the same time, and somehow never once made it their entire personality? That's Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980, they are the generation nobody talks about, not because they're boring, but because they were trained from childhood to believe their pain wasn't worth mentioning. If you are Gen X or raised by someone who is, here's what science actually says about that get over it mentality. It didn't make you cold. It made you one of the most psychologically complex, deeply resilient, and quietly misunderstood generations alive today. Let's start at the beginning. The term latchkey kid refers to children who came home from school to an empty house, key around their neck, parents not yet home from work. For Gen X, this wasn't an occasional experience. It was Tuesday. Researchers at the UCL Institute of Education, tracking nearly 4,000 individuals born in England, Scotland, and Wales in 1970 through the British cohort study, found that psychological distress in Gen X increased by more than 8% between adolescence and early adulthood, a trajectory that surprised even the researchers, who had predicted things would get better with age. They didn't. Because Gen X wasn't struggling with a single dramatic trauma, they were struggling with the slow accumulation of something harder to name, emotional solitude as the default setting of childhood. And here's where neuroscience gets genuinely unsettling. When children experience chronic low-level stress, not dramatic abuse, but the steady hum of coming home to silence, managing their own schedules, handling their own emotions without a co-regulator, their bodies respond by chronically elevating cortisol, the stress hormone. Research published in peer-reviewed neuroscience literature, including studies at the NIH, shows that excessive cortisol during development can suppress neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for memory and emotional regulation, and alter the architecture of the prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and impulse control. The brain doesn't just feel the stress, it reorganizes itself around it. What that reorganization produced in Gen X is something psychologists now recognize as a very specific cognitive style. Psychologist Julie Norham at Wellesley College spent decades studying what she calls defensive pessimism, a mental strategy where you lower your expectations for an outcome, mentally simulate everything that could go wrong, and then prepare for it. Most people assume pessimism is a character flaw, a failure of hope. But Norham's research found the opposite. Defensive pessimists consistently outperform optimists in high-stakes, high-uncertainty situations because they've already wargamed the bad outcomes. Gen X didn't develop this strategy because they're cynical. They developed it because they grew up in what researchers call high-contingency environments, homes where the plan could change without notice, where adults weren't always there to catch the fall. Their brains learned to catch their own falls. Here's where it gets interesting. Because it wasn't just cortisol and empty houses, Gen X came to age during a historically specific window of institutional collapse. They watched their parents' marriages dissolved. The U.S. divorce rate peaked in the early 1980s, right as the oldest Gen Xers were entering adolescence. They watched companies that had promised lifetime employment start issuing mass layoffs. They watched Cold War anxiety play as background noise on the evening news every single night. And then, just when they finally got their footing in the workforce, the dot-com bubble burst. And then, when they had mortgages and children, 2008 happened. Behavioral economists Kahneman and Tversky's foundational work on loss aversion tells us that losses feel approximately twice as powerful as equivalent gains. Gen X didn't experience one loss. They experienced a repeating pattern of them, which is why their nervous systems built something that looks from the outside like emotional unavailability, but from the inside feels like hard-won, bone-deep pragmatism. And let's talk about attachment, because this is crucial. Developmental psychologist John Bowlby showed that children form mental models, called attachment schemas, based on how consistently available their caregivers were. When caregivers are inconsistently available, children often develop what's known as avoidant attachment, a strategy of emotional self-sufficiency that quietly says, "I'll need less from you, so I'll be hurt less by you." For many Gen Xers, this wasn't pathology, it was survival math. Research published in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers report significantly lower levels of seeking social support than both millennials and baby boomers, not because they don't need it, but because the neural circuitry that asks for it was never fully reinforced during the years it was supposed to be. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. Solston's comprehensive psychological assessment, analyzing data across tens of thousands of adults, found that Gen X scores higher on self-control, stable-mindedness, and fearlessness than both millennials and Gen Z, significantly higher, not marginally. Their independence isn't weakness dressed up as strength. It is measurable, documented psychological capacity built through sustained challenge. George Bonanno at Columbia University, one of the world's leading resilience researchers, distinguishes between resilience as bouncing back from trauma versus never fully fracturing in the first place. Gen X, by that definition, is the latter category. And then there's what sociologists call the sandwich generation dynamic, the position of simultaneously caring for aging parents while raising children, while holding down full careers, while smiling at family dinners and asking if anyone needs anything. A 2022 national profile study published in the journal BMC reported that sandwich generation caregivers reported emotional difficulties at a rate of 44% compared to 32% in non-sandwich caregivers, alongside significantly higher rates of financial strain and caregiver role overload. Gen X is currently living this, quietly, without a hashtag about it. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly, because validating your identity is not the same as telling you the truth. The same independence that makes Gen X extraordinary can quietly become a cage. There is a meaningful difference between self-reliance forged from genuine strength and emotional avoidance forged from a childhood wound that never fully healed. If you are Gen X, ask yourself, when was the last time you actually let someone help you, not because you had no other option, but because you chose to let them in? There is a version of I've got it that is empowered, grounded, and freely chosen, and there's a version that is armor. The research is unambiguous that the capacity to receive care is one of the strongest predictors of long-term psychological and physical health. The inability to be supported is not toughness. In the clinical sense, it is a loss. But here is what I want to leave you with. Generation X is proof that the human brain, under the right or terribly wrong conditions, builds something remarkable out of very little. They are the generation that raised themselves, built the internet before anyone told them it was possible, survived every institutional betrayal of the last 4 decades, and still showed up for everyone around them. No viral moment about it, no documentary series, no Generation War Twitter thread, just work. There is a Japanese concept called mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the quiet wisdom that comes from having known loss early and often. Gen X has that in abundance, not because they chose it, because life handed it to them young and they made it into something useful. You are not the forgotten generation. You are the generation that learned, long before anyone else, that you were the only one reliably going to show up for yourself. And then you showed up for everyone else too. That is not a flaw. That is a foundation. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your support.